Welcome to Talking School Sports. I'm Neil Rollings. I'm delighted to be joined by Sanjay Bhandari, who's the chief of the Kick It Out charity, aimed at reducing or eliminating racism and discrimination from football and all sports. Maybe Sanjay, you could just start by telling us a bit about what Kick It Out does and why it's necessary.
Yeah, so Kick It Out started 27 years ago in 1993. As a small charity really primarily focused on kicking racism out of football, and it was formed at a point in time when racism, particularly towards players, was a really major issue, and more importantly, maybe football hadn't acknowledged that it was an issue or understood it and started to work on any remedies for it. You roll the tape forward 27 years, obviously society has changed, and so what do we do now? Well, actually, we tackle discrimination of all kinds, and not just racism, but any representing any underrepresented or minority community. And also, actually, the majority of our work is on promoting inclusion in football to make football a place where everyone feels we belong. And so, we really have sort of three broad areas of activity. There's sort of campaigning and reporting, so advocacy, public policy, launching awareness campaigns, launching campaigns that have an action at the end of it, but also managing reports and data transparency around football, around discrimination, but we're trying to expand those data transparency services. There's guidance and education, so guiding clubs that are trying to go through things like the Premier League equality standard and help them with their inclusion journey and the right policies and practices, but also educating kids in the academies from under 9s to under 23s across all the Premier League on inclusion and tackling discrimination. And then the final limb is talent, which is we try to help to create and inspire opportunity. So working with the industry and with people coming into or already in the industry to help them to get in, stay in and get on in the football industry so that it becomes more representative of the people who play and watch the game.
So why is your body necessary? And does it eventually become redundant as time goes by, or?
It possibly becomes redundant. I think obviously the mission of an organisation like ours is to make ourselves redundant, which is to eliminate discrimination from the game. I think we also have to be realistic about society, and people have always, I suppose, lived in tribes and had affinities to tribes. And so until you remove that tribalism from human beings, there will probably always be an element of discrimination that either you're in my tribe or you're in somebody else's tribe. And so I think the need for an organisation like ours will evolve. I'm not sure it will ever be completely eliminated, but I think the nature of the problems that we're dealing with will change as they have changed over the last 27 years.
Yeah. And I grew up on Merseyside in the 70s and 80s watching football, probably when the earliest black players were involved, and it wasn't a pretty occasion. What's been achieved since then? What's been achieved in the last 40 years in inclusion?
Yeah, I started watching football at around the same time. My first football memories were actually Liverpool winning the cup in '74, and then the World Cup in 1974. And I was from Wolverhampton, so the referee in that final was a butcher from Wolverhampton, Jack Taylor. So yeah, it was that similar era. And of course, as we go back now, we realise that actually there were black players in the English game way before that, and going back to the 30s and so on. But the 70s really was a seminal moment because of players like Clyde Best, and then Brendan Batson, Cyril Regis, Laurie Cunningham at West Brom, and because of also, I suppose, the advent of TV and football on TV, so it was much more in our face, and we were aware of it. And I think football has changed. I mean, just look at the sheer number of black players in the game. It got up to 25 to 30% in the Premier League, and you know, I've just reeled off some names, and they were the first 4 or 5, but they were, you know, in many ways the only 4 or 5 for long periods of time. So much more inclusive on the pitch, certainly for black players. In the stands, I've been going to football for over 30 years, home and away, following my team, and it's probably not the same team as yours, but I've seen that profile change. I rarely saw people like me, particularly going through away matches, and I'd have to be so careful going to games. But I see that much more. Now, there's still plenty of work to be done. So there has been progress over 30 years. I think it's really tempting when we're going through a period where things are getting worse, right? Because over the last 4 or 5 years, things have definitely got worse, and that connects to broader political things that are going on in the world. But at the same time, things are much better than they were 40 years ago. And those two things can be true and are true at the same time. And it's probably wrong to think of progress as being a straight line. It's not. It goes in ebbs and flows and cycles, and things get better, and then they maybe get slightly worse, and then they get better, and then they get slightly worse. We are in a period where over the last 4 or 5 years, things have been getting worse.
Why is that, do you think?
So I think that's a much more complex question than maybe there are people that spend hours and write 300-page books about this subject. My sense is there are lots of socio-political things that are going on in the world that are causing us to move much more into our tribes. And in many ways, part of the problem is that the rest of life, the rest of the world is becoming more like and too much like football. We're becoming increasingly tribal as a society. Now, there's been this sort of economic polarization, haves and have-nots, and the income inequality between the lowest and the highest paid in society is the highest it's ever been. That's exacerbated by automation and emergent technology. You've probably got a breakdown or a shift in the axis of public trust, that we no longer trust our bosses or our leaders, but actually we trust our peers, because we do with things like Facebook recommendations, Amazon recommendations, and social media then exacerbates those challenges, because we only start listening to people who have the same opinions as us. And when someone has a different opinion to us, rather than playing the ball, we play the player and start attacking the person to undermine their opinion. All of those things have subtly been going on in society over the last 5 or 6 years, so that we're in these increasingly insulated tribes. I think that's partly what's generating some of the hate that we're seeing, and and also the anonymity of the crowd online mirrors the anonymity of a crowd in real life. So all of those things, I think, are combining to create this febrile atmosphere.
But if you say it's a cyclical thing, then Sanjay, how do you get out of that? If we're in the ebb of that cycle, none of those things that you've described seem to be cyclical as well. How do you get out of the cycle in those circumstances?
Yeah, and it's because I think what you're sort of getting at is some of the things that we're experiencing are completely new because of the advent of technology and the challenges that we're getting with social media. They're brand new challenges that we've never experienced before in this challenge over the last 40 years. But again, history provides us with those answers, because every new media actually has these challenges. You go back to the invention of the Gutenberg press, right? And the Ottomans banned the Gutenberg press, right? And then you go back to the invention of radio and the way that radio was used in the 1930s as a tool of propaganda. These were unintended consequences of a new form of media. Well, guess what? The way that hate is being peddled now online are unintended consequences of that new media. I think the answer to that is this is a behavior and technology problem. So you need behavior and technology solutions. So the approach we've been taking is, I want to work with Facebook and Twitter. I don't just want to be standing outside the building, shouting at them and throwing rocks at them. I need to do that occasionally, but I need to work with them, because the technology that creates the problem will also create the answers. And that's, I think, where the kind of secret lies, is in working more closely with them to help to develop the answers to these problems.
And can sport really overcome social problems as ingrained as racism? As you say, the tribal nature of it. Can sport really have a role in that, or can it just stop people doing it for 90 minutes on a Saturday afternoon?
I think we know that and it's a classic question. It's almost chicken and egg, isn't it? Does sport influence behaviour, or does behaviour influence sport? And I know other people will have a different view, but I'm firmly of the view that sport can influence people's behaviour. And I suppose my evidence for that is, look at the way people behave in a crowd. Think about yourself when you behave in a crowd. Do you behave the way you would when you go to a restaurant? Do you behave the same? I bet you don't. You know, the emotions are engaged, and you will do and say things and behave in ways that you wouldn't normally. So you know for a fact that sport can influence behaviour. And then you look at the ways that it can be positive. The high watermark in many ways in the last decade was 2012 and the London Olympics. You know, and I can go back to Euro 96 and the way this country felt in Euro 96. And every time England do well in a World Cup tournament, look at the positive feelings. Look how we felt in 2018. There was a summer with that really diverse team where there was such pride in what they'd achieved as a young team, which felt like a surprise. I think those are evidence points that say, of course you can, that sport can influence behaviour. It's actually how you manage to do that consciously.
And but does that impact last after the excitement of the final whistle, or does that impact start diminishing the moment the whistle's blown?
I think it depends on the nature of the intervention. With things like you know, a tournament, often those things last, you know, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, maybe afterwards. The feel good factor goes into the following season, and then maybe other things start impacting. But we've also seen it with things like the sort of post Hillsborough world and the movement to all-seater stadia, and how all of those things in the early 90s changed the behaviour of supporters. Amazing. You treat people like human beings and they start behaving like them. You treat people like animals and shoving us in pens and locking us in after games, and we start behaving like animals. And so I think clearly there is a way in which you can manage the game and manage the sport that can influence behaviour. And I think that's the challenge for us now, is how do we use sport to influence the behaviour of people and influence what they feel, their affinity to their club and what that club stands for, and taking some pride in the values, for instance, around things like inclusion. So it definitely has that ability to change people's behaviour, but it's actually activating that in a really strategic way that I think is the big challenge that we haven't quite cracked in this wave that we're in, particularly with social media as a big part of that wave.
And what would be the evidence of progress? What would there be more black managers? Would social media look different? When you're looking for the markers of what that world would look like if it was different, obviously there's the underlying behaviour that causes it, but what would be the evidence of that behaviour? How would things look different?
Yeah, I think we probably separate out two things, which is tackling discrimination and promoting inclusion. Okay, so how will we know that things are better from a tackling discrimination perspective? I think one of the key things that we need to get to now is to scratch below the surface. So we don't really have much root cause analysis of why people behave the way in which they behave, and any kind of taxonomy of offence and offenders. And the reality is, unless you do that, we'll still just be reliving Groundhog Day every year and saying, well, the numbers have gone up and this is how it looks. So I think we'll start making progress when we start understanding who's doing this and why they're doing it. And so that's certainly something I'm working on at the moment with the football authorities and government and law enforcement and counterintelligence and stuff like that. I think from a promoting inclusion perspective, I think it's the really big stubborn challenges. So I think the big stubborn challenges in English football, I think there are really, in the men's game, there are three of them. One is the boardrooms are predominantly white and male. The second is that there are not enough black coaches, and I do mean black coaches, not black or black and Asian or BAME. And the reason I say that is because coaching, traditionally the pathway has come from playing, and not exclusively, but traditionally, and maybe for the majority of coaches. And there are 25-30% black players, there are 10, not 10%, 10 professional Asian players, right? It's a different problem. So let's be really brutally honest. It's about getting more black players through the coaching pipeline, so that they're properly reflected in the coaching fraternity. And then the last one actually is Asian players. Is the complete absence of Asian players. There are twice as many, between 2 and 3 times as many people of Asian heritage than of black heritage in the UK. Black people are doing incredibly well in football, and we want that same success for Asians. There are 100 times more professional black players than there are Asian players. So that tells you the scale of the journey that we need to go on, and that kind of thing can't be happening without some structural bias sort of built into the culture, and we have to unpick that and understand it. So I think we'll know we're making progress. On the first 2, actually, we've got the Football Leadership Diversity Code. We've got 40 clubs that have signed up to targets on coaching and on senior leadership. And, I think the job of organisations like ours is to keep the score and to keep them honest, and every year to be saying, this is how you're doing, and to be monitoring the data. So we let the data speak. I think on Asian inclusion, we need to spend a bit longer in the problem to understand it, because at the moment, my sense is there are 3 stages to challenge dealing with a problem like that. You have to acknowledge it, you have to understand it, and then you have to create remedies. My sense is we tend to jump over step 2. We go, I acknowledge there's a problem. The answer is this. Yeah, well, have you understood where the drop-off is? Do you know how many numbers there are at under 9s, under 10s, under 12s? What's the point at which Asians drop off? Right at that point, have you started talking to people to understand the stories behind the data? That's the bit that I think we really need to work on, and then we'll start to see progress when we start to see those numbers change. Look, ultimately for me, everything always comes back to the numbers and the data, and let's use the data to form our strategies, not just the opinions of highly paid people.
And what do you see, what's the role of the FA in this then, Sanjay? You've obviously got your organisation, you're a pressure group, etc. But the FA will be the most powerful national and governing body, certainly in the country, possibly in the world. What's its role in this?
I think the role of the FA is to provide leadership. Ultimately, they have obviously a significant role as the main governing body for football, but of course, the Premier League is where the money's at, and really, when you talk about the Premier League, you mean the member clubs. It's the Premier League clubs. That's where the biggest power in English football is. It's the 20 Premier League clubs. Obviously, the FA is the focal point, is the face for English football, and so I think what we're looking for from them is leadership. And certainly, I have many conversations with the CEO of the FA and work with them on a almost daily basis. And I know how much inclusion is part of their strategy. It's a sort of tent pole of their strategy. So yeah, I think that's what we're after from them, is clear leadership and people that really get and understand this and are passionate about it.
And so were recent events, were they a low point in that journey?
Yeah, so it was a step back. The thing is no 2 ways about that. That's a step back. But I think because it's not one comment, it's 3 or 4 comments that demonstrate actually you don't get this in your bones. It's not something that you're passionate about and you understand. And I think for the leader of that organisation, you have to, because it's such a significant part of their strategy. So I don't know how you could. There's a kind of competence point there. If that is such a significant part of your strategy, and you don't get that, then what are you doing in that role? So it's certainly a step back, I think. But also there are some. As a leader, I think you have to be an optimist, and I'm an optimist by nature. And there are some positive things that come out of that. One, which is, look how quickly it happened. There's very little debate about it. And people accepting that it was the right thing that Greg did to resign. And then it gives you an opportunity to find a leader that represents the values of the FA that I know and the FA that I work with every day, because those comments did not represent the people that I work with. And I've had so many people from the FA reach out to me having exactly this kind of dialogue.
And presumably then that draws attention to the fact that the speed of the response to it draws attention to the fact that it's not tolerated, and therefore maybe does present an opportunity to move forward.
That's precisely it. That's precisely it. It tells you this is what we stand for. That's not what we stand for. So I'm sorry, there's no place for you in the organisation.
And finally, I know this is a potentially toxic topic, but that whole thing about the language and how the language reflects attitudes, update us on what that language should be.
I look, and it's always a difficult area, okay, like language, and language evolves, doesn't it? And so should we take for example what Greg said, you know, the use of that particular C word. It's a different C word to the one that's normally offensive, but that particular C word, right? Now, as you and I were brought up in the 1970s, when I was a kid, actually calling someone that C word, that was the accepted form, and actually you didn't call someone black, that was regarded as offensive, and now it's flipped, okay? And I've worked on other government initiatives on looking at ethnicity of UK boards of our FTSE 100, our biggest companies, and we had the longest debate about how do we define the people that we're seeking to help, and so we ended up on using the phrase persons of colour. We had that same debate with the Football Leadership Diversity Code. Should it be BAME? Should it be persons of colour? Where we ended up was actually kind of adopting what the census definitions were. So, but with a slight tweak, because the census will be updated next year. So we said black, Asian, or dual heritage. Okay. Now I think, and look, the language will evolve, and there, you know, so you'll get some people who will be offended by one word or another word or another word. I think there's a cultural piece, which is we need to stop policing content and start judging intent. And that was my challenge with what Greg said last week, was if it was just the content and he'd said the wrong word and he'd apologized, that would be one thing. It was actually the apology wasn't very good, and then he went on to say 3 other things which actually indicated you don't get this, right? Because there's some lazy stereotypes. That was the challenge, not. And the media don't help, because they then focus on just that one word. You go, he didn't lose his job because of that one word. He lost his job because of the attitude reflected by the rest of the statements. Okay. My own personal feeling is it's time to go beyond BAME. So I think BAME was a really useful thing because it created a collective noun, and it meant people were comfortable creating things like targets, which create action, which create change, and they've got something they can measure. It's now time to go beyond that, because my experience is, as a collective noun, that masks inequalities within that collective noun. And I come from 2 different experiences, 2 different inequalities being masked, okay? My professional background in the city, I saw a lot of A and not very much B. So the presence of A would mask the absence of B. So you need to actually have a specific strategy that thinks, why have we got an absence of black people in the city? In football, it's the other way around. The presence of B completely masks the absence of A. Where are the Asians? So we need to do something to target that. That's why I think across society and across industry, it's time to go beyond BAME. And my preference would be to focus on black, Asian, dual heritage. Right? Those are the kinds of language we can be comfortable and confident in using. But I know for a lot of white people, they find using the word black really difficult, because they worry that people are going to be offended by that. And people of a certain vintage and a certain age, because they've been brought up at a certain time, will find that more difficult than others. But, you know, that's, unfortunately, that's life. It all evolves. You know, we're all only a kind of, you know, part of the culture and social media. We're all only a slip of the tongue away from being cancelled. And so I don't agree with that either. I don't agree with the Twitter pitchfork mob piling on to try and get someone to lose their job. That's not right either. So I think my plea is judge people on their intent, not their content. We know what their attitude is. Of course, the words are evidence of that. But sometimes also you have to forgive that people make errors and can be clumsy with language. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're a bad person or that their attitude is wrong. It might just be their background and what they've been brought up with and the language they've been used to. Slightly long answer, but I don't think there's a sort of there isn't a this is the word to use this and don't use that. It's all contextual, and so in a way there's no bad words, there are only bad contexts.
And looking into the crystal ball, will the game solve this problem, do you think, or is it here to stay?
I think I think we will get through this wave as we have got through every other wave, and we'll find a way. I think what's really this wave of challenges, what's I suppose is good is that people are focused on it and they've got time and attention on it. There's also, across most of football, there's a whole generation of new leaders, right? So pretty much all the big organisations, the FA, Premier League, EFL, have changed chairman and chief executive in the last 2 or 3 years, and the PFA are just going through that process now as well. So I think you've got more modern leadership in all of those organisations, I think, which will really help.
And is there a place for schools in this journey?
Absolutely, because so much is learned in that environment, and the attitudes that are formed, and I think particularly between the ages of 11 and 16, when my experience attitudes start sort of hardening, and it becomes more difficult thereafter to change people's ways of thinking. And look, ultimately, where does all discrimination come from? In my sense is it comes from mostly from places of ignorance, and mostly from a lack of experience of being around people of that difference. And so the more we can create those opportunities for those interactions, the better, because then you start seeing that there's actually much more that unites us and that we have in common than we have that is different. We all want this pretty much the same things out of life, to be happy and to do well, and in whatever our chosen field is, and that doesn't matter what whether you're from a majority or underrepresented or minority communities. That's pretty much common for everyone, but it's creating those engagements, and that can happen much more at school, and to form those attitudes so that things don't escalate. But of course, what you can't do is you can't control everything that goes on at home.
Sanjay, many thanks for your time. Really appreciate that, and congratulations on all the good work you're doing.
Thank you.